contribution. Evidence. I'll click got it for recording. And I will put on. The page is no longer working. I'll use the mouse. Okay, very good. So actually, here's where I was. So in around 1990 is when the evidence-based medicine era is usually attributed as having started. I would say that simplistic hierarchies of research design evolved at the time, designating randomized controlled trials as a gold standard, but also suggesting unnecessarily that non-randomized study designs might be not trustworthy or not worth bothering with at all. So we and others were in a minority situation at the time. These are representative examples. Benson and Hartz found little evidence that estimates of treatment effects in observational studies were consistently larger than or qualitatively different from those obtained in randomized controlled trials. And we found that the results of well-designed cohort and case control studies also did not systematically overestimate the magnitude of effect. It's a little nuance in history, but the thought at the time was that not only were observational studies wrong, but they always or almost always overestimated. So we just did a study that we looked at different topics. You can read it at your own leisure. The main take-home point for today is that did not go over well. This is the editorial in the same issue of the same journal, the same week. Only randomized treatment assignment can provide a reliably unbiased estimate of treatment effects. Perhaps we have not tried hard enough to convert the skeptics. So that just gives a sense of the dynamic at the time. This is in part history, in part sociology. If you fast forward to a few years ago, we still have vestiges of what we saw in 2000, the magic of randomization versus the myth of real-world evidence. Because of potential biases, observational studies cannot be trusted. And here's my complaint. Quote, replacement of randomized trials with non-randomized observational analyses. No one, certainly not ourselves, is suggesting replacement. The question is, can we have more than one tool in the toolbox? And I will invoke Angus Deaton and Nancy Cartwright. As I said, sorry, Ida, we presented yesterday and some of these slides are the same, so I have to stop myself. This audience didn't hear it before. Even if you disagree with Deaton and Cartwright, Angus Deaton won the Nobel Prize in Economics, not for this quote or this work, but he does have a pretty good pedigree, so at least we should take him seriously. We argue that any special status is unwarranted. Which method is likely to yield a good causal inference depends on what we are trying to discover, as well as on what is already known. So now I'm going to pivot and say, and you all are I use quite often, but now I'm preaching to the converted and the teachers. You can correct me if there's anything wrong in this slide. The term I thought appeared in the computer science literature during the 1990s, referring to data too large to be stored in then conventional storage systems. I have one representative quote, it's actually not so contemporary anymore, but big data for a while was shorthand for advancing trends and technology that opened the door to new approaches. Dr. Sim had a wonderful slide that was a screenshot of The Economist from 2017. So big data is all the rage these days. But am I correct in saying that modern technology has increased the quantity and forms of data, available data, as well as the speed to merge and manipulate? But integration and analysis of large-scale data has always been integral to epidemiology. My gray hair allows me to say that I did a medical record study of 1,002 paper records, where one of the biggest feasibility challenges was pulling the records from veterans at a VA hospital at the time. Now you hit the F10 key and you're on your merry way. A real-world evidence, if you do a Google or a Medline search, real-world, if you go back far enough, was a very non-specific modifier. It kind of sort of means the same thing each time, but you could find instances in the medical literature, but in various contexts. It's not what we're talking about now. That's the whole point of my talk today. What is real-world evidence as of 2024, actually as of 2016, as you'll see. Real-world data and real-world evidence have formal regulatory definitions. You guys don't have to worry about it in your day-to-day lives. It's certainly in your academic work. If you ever team up with the sponsor, it does matter, and it matters in general because our languages matter and our dialects, so to speak, can be confusing. But I think we should acknowledge that older epidemiologic terms were just fine. They were sufficient. But it's the emergence of big data combined with the 21st Century Cures Act, which is bidirectional. The Cures Act didn't come out of thin air. Big data was already on the scene. So what I'm here to talk about is the sometimes confusing use of different taxonomies for study design. If you hear real-world evidence, do not automatically think of an observational study for reasons that I'll describe. I always stop to ask, what are the data sources? What is the study design? I want to know that anyway, not this somewhat vague term of real-world evidence. Here's the 21st Century Cures Act. If you haven't seen it before, it actually has multiple parts, but for real-world evidence, FDA shall establish a program to evaluate the potential use of real-world evidence to support a new indication for a drug already approved. But by the way, the first sub-bullet, probably approved by clinical trial. So this is if a drug is already on the market, do we have to do another trial or two to get it approved for a new indication? Can we use the real-world data that is out there? Not a bad idea. Or to satisfy post-approval study requirements, which is a technical, there's post-marketing requirements and commitments in FDA regs. We have to issue a draft framework, have to issue draft guidance. There's something called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. I'm not sure if that's a household term. Basically, part of our budget is paid for by user fees. So when a sponsor submits an application, they're not paying for their review, but they're contributing so that the taxpayer doesn't have to carry the whole burden. It's a long story, but I don't believe it at all affects my and my colleagues' ability to evaluate submissions, but it is part of the landscape. And there's no mandate regarding evidence beyond evaluate. So that leaves it to us to come up with a roadmap forward. Sorry, I shouldn't say roadmap in this context. Here's a 30,000-foot view of how the FDA works. There's laws, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the drug amendments of 1962 require substantial evidence of effectiveness from adequate and well-controlled investigations. Now, there's more text than that, but that's about as specific as it gets in terms of the crux of the matter. And the Modernization Act of 97 allows for evidence from one adequate and well-controlled investigation. It used to be a two-trial rule. AIDS had a lot to do with this. Waiting for two trials to be completed, AIDS patients were dying, and the AIDS activist community basically said, what's going on here? So there's a lot of sociology and history in terms of prompting the FDA to change, which is good. And how that plays out is what we're responsible for. But I will say the law becomes regulation. These are epidemiologic criteria in a way. I didn't memorize it, but 314.126, I don't have to look at the slide. That is the quote unquote Bible for how we evaluate studies. It articulates what constitutes an adequate and well-controlled study. It doesn't say trials, but it does talk about bias. It does talk about concurrent controls or other types. It's basically, to distinguish the effect of a drug from other influences. I tip my hat to those who wrote this in the 1970s. They didn't know what it would be used for in 2024 or 2016, but it has survived the test of time exceedingly well. And then after regulation, FDA, and I probably have too many slides on guidance. In the interest of time, I'll cut some of them. But what we do is we sort of translate, in quotes, regulation and statute into guidance. We have a paragraph at the end of the introduction for every guidance that says, basically, don't quote me here, this guidance represents FDA's current thinking. It is not law. You don't have to follow it, but if you don't follow it, it's sort of at your own risk. Because we're not dictating exactly. It's not a checklist, but it's our thinking in terms of the subject matter. Okay, so here's how we responded to the 21st Century Cures Act. Ahead of time or on-time delivery, we have a real-world evidence framework. The link is there in case you're curious, but it is dated now, but it's our roadmap for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Center for Biologics, and the Oncology Center. I do want to give a thumbs up to our colleagues in the Center for Devices. It does make life more challenging, but they have their own regulations. These are not drugs or biologics. So for better or for worse, for better, we work together and we communicate. But for worse, in one sense, if you're on the outside of the FDA, you have to know whether you're dealing with the Center for Devices or the Center for Drugs. And there are drug-device combinations that make things even more complicated. But as we discussed in the previous hour, for those who were part of a small group meeting, this should be familiar for those students who just are listening to this talk. Our program involves internal agency processes such as educating. We'll actually have a slide, I think, or two that describes this external stakeholder engagement, demonstration projects, aka research projects, and guidance development. Okay, let me, before I go any further, introduce real-world definitions or the definitions of real-world data and real-world evidence. Remarkably non-technical, remarkably simple, and I would argue non-technical, but for good reason. So real-world data are data relating to patient health status or delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. Think of EHRs, electronic health records, claims, registries, etc. Real-world evidence was intentionally defined as the evidence regarding the potential benefits and risks of a medical product derived from the analysis of real-world data. Notice that in the bottom right, including but not limited to randomized trials can generate real-world evidence. If one says, well, how? I'll invoke from, I wasn't involved with this, at our sister center in Boston, VA Medical Center. They randomized patients to hydrochlorothiazide or chlorothalidone, two commonly used diuretics. After they randomized them in the research setting, they passively collected the outcomes via the electronic health record. It was cardiovascular outcomes. So MI, stroke, and death are reliably captured, all else being equal, in the electronic health record. That's called a point of care trial. So that from a regulatory basis, that is generating real world evidence. I don't mean to say, wow, fireworks should go off, but from a regulatory point of view, that is in line. Now, that wasn't submitted to the FDA. Those drugs are already approved, but it's an example of a methodology that could be used going forward so that we don't have to do, and by the way, it was about 1/10 the cost of the trial because you didn't have to have this huge infrastructure to collect outcomes, et cetera. So I'll try to sprinkle these examples in to give it a little bit of reality, but these are the definitions proper. Here's where I'm catching up with those 4 pillars or 4 domains. So again, this is more for those who engage with the FDA, but just briefly, we have a subcommittee that helps coordinate internal activities and external activities. In the interest of time, I'll play catch up here and say that our demonstration projects, which is most relevant probably to you all, not that you're going to write a grant tomorrow, but we have a Health and Human Services UO1 collaborative mechanism. Of course, the UCSF Stanford CERSI is an example of one of the, I think we're up to 10 centers of excellence in regulatory science and innovation. Individual contracts, including broad agency announcements. FDA Catalyst is linked to our Sentinel program, which I don't have time to talk about. And then we have an interagency agreement with the Department of Veterans Affairs where we try to take advantage of their improved structure. Here's where I think, again, demonstration projects would be something that would, and actually I'm going to give credit to folks who are in attendance today, but let me start more generally. We view our demonstration projects informally as being in three categories of either improving the use or quality of real world data, addressing study design issues, or a third category, which I should use air quotes to say are basically tools. These are not this taxonomy is far from perfect, but it allows us to sort of describe these projects. These are 6 examples. Our office alone supports over 20 demonstration projects over the past 5 years, but I'll just read them and say 2 words about them. Increasing the scope of real-world data with unstructured EHR data, that's a trust project acronym. It was awarded to Verantos, a private entity, and the deal there is what appealed to us, and this is an internal peer review. I didn't, just make the decision on my own. But when you hear EHR data in the real world evidence space, most often what we're talking about is pulling structured elements. There's an awful lot of information in unstructured fields, and that's what the state of the art. They're not the only ones trying to advance the state of the art, but that's an example. I use this slide quite frequently, so I'm not being parochial by saying the One Source project with UCSF. Dr. Esserman et al. Is an example of trying to improve the quality of EHR data. I don't think Laura would mind me paraphrasing it by quoting her and saying, why wouldn't clinicians want research grade data at the bedside? Why is it that we have this 2-tier system where it's good enough for patient when we're in the patient? Why would we want to settle for data that isn't good enough for a research project? In terms of study design, I'll have a slide on RC duplicate, so I'll skip over it right now. We have an award to UNC Genentech, a combination of an academic and a sponsor, looking at statistical approaches for trials with hybrid control arms. That is, you have participants randomized to the drug of interest and say a comparator or a placebo, but then instead of having the entire control arm be real participants enrolled, can you bring in a real world data source? And you all are statisticians, I'm not, what are these statistical issues? And do you use a frequentist approach or a Bayesian approach, or probably not both, but that's the type of advancing the state of the art that project is intending to address. The tools, and again, you could say that the statistical approach might be a tool, but targeted learning for causal effect estimation is where I catch up with present company, got an award, congratulations. If I start naming names, I'll leave folks out, so I'll just make eye contact in the audience. And then evaluation of confounded treatment effects is an award as well, to actually, in that case, to University of North Carolina. There are various tools to address confounding. And again, apropos of our conversation an hour ago, the outcome of that demonstration project is not thou shalt use tool X, Y, or Z, but rather what do we think of tools X, Y, Z, A, B, C, so that it's the right tool for the job when a particular submission comes into the FDA. What I've done for this talk, and I think we're doing okay on time, is just have a couple of examples. So this was intentionally picking the Trust Project, and this is not from their actual work, but it's related work. The title is Retrospective Comparison of Traditional and AI-Based Heart Failure Phenotyping in a U.S. Health System to Enable Real-World Evidence. And you have the citation if you want to read it. But a traditional RWE generation approach resulted in low quality with patients with heart failure. While an advanced approach demonstrated high accuracy, the results vary dramatically based on extraction techniques. For future studies, these approaches and measurements may be required to ensure the data are fit for purpose. This is just a snippet of what that demonstration project was intending to cover. Here's the RCT duplicate, which I alluded to but didn't say much about. This is all about trial emulation. Now, trial emulation is a general category. You might be aware target trial emulation doesn't have a copyright, I don't believe, but it's a particular approach that's been endorsed. I would say that this project was funded at a time where, as I heard a colleague say, even a broken clock is correct twice a day, meaning that if you go back far enough, again, to the 2000 way of thinking, well, if you find an observational study that's correct, okay, but by chance alone, that's going to happen every once in a while. So what a group at Brigham and Women's did, Schneeweiss, Wang, Jesse Franklin, before she left et al., they compared real-world evidence studies and found they basically took claims data or claims and EHR data and emulated a clinical trial and said, can we get the same answer? Most of these were done for previously completed trials, but a bunch of them were done for trials that were ongoing. And the results that I found was that this is a half full, half empty glass. Real-world evidence studies, and I might quibble with their wording there, can reach similar conclusions as RCTs when design and measurements can be closely emulated, but this may be difficult to achieve. Concordance varies depending on the agreement metric, which you can read about. Emulation differences, chance, and residual confounding. So this is an appropriately worded, almost ambiguous result, but I think we learned a lot of lessons. And part of this too, it's basic, right? If you're not addressing the same research question, don't be surprised if you get a different answer. That's true for hormone replacement therapy, controversy from about 20 years ago. So I think the one take-home message is it's not as simple as saying, do randomized trial, get the right answer, and do observational studies, get the wrong answer. But again, you all know that. And then third, and here's where I am naming names, and thank you again for collaborating with the FDA, but here's where we have targeted learning being published last year, where quality and reliability of real-world data must be systematically evaluated. Targeted learning roadmap prescribes how to carry out a thorough, transparent, and realistic assessment. We recommend this approach be a routine part of any decision-making process. So all of these efforts are intended to improve the field, improve the state of the art, and that's part of the FDA's effort. And that, by the way, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the R in CDER, as we like to say, is for research. So this shows that we're honoring our obligations. All right, now I'm switching gears to guidance. Let me pause. We're halfway through. So far, any feedback and any questions, burning questions, or is this relevant to your, especially to the students, to your, it might not be directly relevant to your day-to-day work, but is it, do I have your attention? Any too fast, too slow? Good. Okay.
There's like 36 people online.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, I can't see them. Yeah. If anyone has a question, thank you, Maya, online. Oh, okay. Oh, from before. Okay. All right. I'll let you, Daniel. I'll let you help me raise your hand or get my attention if I need to stop. I do want to run through, though, FDA's approach to guidance. You don't have to pull these and read them, but I do think that I'm going to ask a favor, as I did from your colleagues earlier in the past hour. When we publish draft guidance, I don't think it would be very efficient individually, but certainly as an institution or as a program, you don't have to hesitate to submit comments to the docket. The docket is open for like 90 days, and we want to convert our draft guidance to final, including input from the community. But here's a view of the guidance landscape itself, organized chronologically. We have guidances on EHR's claims and registries as data considerations. You see that, and actually our EHR claims is about to be finalized. We also have, actually, I'm sorry, it's not chronological, it's by category. So we have 2 data considerations and 1 submission of data. As I said in the last hour, FDA was set up to ingest data from clinical trials with case report forms. So if you're working in the real world data space, you have a big problem. We can't fault the clinicians at the bedside filling out the data to become an EHR, that they weren't thinking of the FDA's need for data structured in a certain way, whether it's race, ethnicity, or anything else. So these guidances give a roadmap for how to move forward. Regulatory considerations is the applicability of regulations. And in the design category, we have externally controlled trials, non-interventional studies, and randomized controlled trials in clinical practice settings. And the 2 that are in italic font are in development. They're in clearance right now. So I guess I'm going out on a limb, but I think it's a pretty sturdy limb. In calendar year 2024, shame on us if we can't publish these 2 guidances. And at that point, the first generation of guidances will have been released. This doesn't cover everything under the sun, but it's a pretty comprehensive coverage, including the last one, submitting real-world evidence. This is interesting. I don't get to talk about it much. I think for this audience, it gives me an opportunity. We're expected to count and report to Congress on real-world evidence that we see. And when we set out to do it, we ran into what could be called very simply false positives and false negatives in terms of attribution. Why? Well, the false positives were that everyone under the sun said, oh, here's a real-world evidence study. We looked at it. And even this streptomycin trial, sorry, I've said this so many times, from the 1940s, they had to find the patients somewhere. They had to identify the sites. We don't say they used real-world data and therefore they generated real-world evidence in that inaugural modern randomized trial, but that's what some folks were doing. On the flip side, some sponsors were submitting externally controlled trials where the external control arm came from a real-world data source, and they described it beautifully. They just didn't say it was real-world evidence, and I don't blame them. They don't have to. So I don't want to say forgive me because I don't need forgiveness, but we are going to great lengths to try to clean up the language so that an apple is an apple and an orange is an orange, if you will, and that's what that guidance is all about. Here's where I can talk about the EHR claims, just to give a sense of what's in this guidance. It's about to become finalized. It's a selection of data sources to appropriately address the study question. We got a lot of pushback. We wanted to make sure that the definitions for exposures, covariates, and outcomes were validated. And some folks were saying, well, what do you mean valid? Can't we just take what we have? And the answer is no, we need to be confident that the phenotyping makes sense. And if it's been validated in one context, that helps, but that context has to be relevant to the current context. Also, talked a lot about data provenance, but as mentioned, this did not talk about study design or statistical analysis. So here's an example, and here's where you all do this on a day-to-day basis. And I'll just repeat the quotes and leave the figure for your viewing and reading pleasure. The process for examining the quality of data is not a one-time assessment. Rather, it's an ongoing process in the multiple phases. So the main point here is when you go from source data to curated data to transformed data to an analytic data set, I don't know, I have a slide on this. The FDA gets patient level data. We want to redo the analyses and kick the tires on what the sponsor has done. And we can't do that if we just get the summary data. A lot of regulatory agencies around the globe don't do that. I'm not boasting here. It's just a fact. So we have to translate that practice into the real world data sets. Use the arrow instead. Registries, I think I'll, again, keep an eye on the clock and just leave this table of contents slide up for a moment. So nothing groundbreaking here, the relevance of registry data. I will say 2 words about that. Relevance, I hope, is self-explanatory. What's clinically relevant for one question may not be clinically relevant for another. So we are not going to certify a registry as being, grade A, good housekeeping approved. Reliability, we've distilled to accuracy, completeness, and traceability. It's not the only taxonomy you could use, but you could have 3 terms, you could have 4, you could have 6, you could have 10 or more. So we just wanted to say something cogent about the reliability of registry data or EHR data and claims data for that matter. And here, I think I'll leave this slide for your reading later in terms of more information about the registry guidance. Data standards I alluded to. It's processes for managing the real world data. Again, this is more for sponsors, conforming real world data to FDA data standards, mapping to FDA submission standards, and transformations. But if any platforms are developed, I know it's a little bit of a connecting of dots that might not warrant connection. But again, we need practices, policies, and systems for doing this. Here's the regulatory considerations guidance. And I was trying to remember this table of contents in our 10 o'clock meeting, but I think I gave representative examples. Transparency regarding data collection and analysis. That's what I was alluding to, Ida et al., right, when I mentioned about sponsors being able to show that they didn't just change the covariates, change the analyses until they found one that had the drug look in the best possible light, but also access to data, since, as I mentioned, we reanalyze the data, monitoring, reporting, and other responsibilities. And here, I think, in the interest of time, the take-home message on this slide, I won't read it, is even if our investigational new drug application regulations don't apply, human subjects protection is critical. It might be as simple as there's a waiver. When I sign up for my health care, I usually waive my right to my, the EHR data can be pulled. It's anonymized, et cetera, but we do have to worry about these things. Here's where I'm getting more into the weeds, and this is not from, well, it's actually someone else in my office. I should have mentioned another name. I know I mentioned names of folks to reach out to, but Leonard Sachs in our clinical methodology group in the Office of Medical Policy, his team coordinated the writing of this digital health technologies for remote data acquisitions and clinical investigations. And this provides information on the selection of suitable DHTs for clinical research, verification and validation of the DHT to be used. What about using DHTs to collect trial endpoints, and the risk and management of risk associated with their use? And here's where we get into the device-drug dichotomy. Whether or not it's a device is beyond the scope of the guidance. So we just tried to parse the landscape. So you all don't have to worry about it, and maybe I'm being overly not defensive here, but there is a logic, a method to the madness of having individual guidances. In this figure, nothing new, but the idea is that we had our framework in 2018. We have regulatory considerations, which is a standalone guidance. We have data, which are 3 guidances here. We have 3 design guidances, and then there's a procedural. And, actually my point about DHTs is this is a definitional quirk. If a trial gives out a DHT to every trial participant, technically for reporting to Congress, we're not going to call that real world data because it was given to everyone in the trial. If you all can take data from my fitness tracker that I purchased myself and figure out what to do with it, that is, it sounds silly, but we have to have these decisions clear. I think I'll skip over this slide, but the Prescription Drug User Fee Act it has new applications. Actually, I will make 1 or 2 comments. We will, by June 30th of this year, report aggregate data on submissions to CDER and CBER in terms of real-world data, real-world evidence. That's closing the loop on that false positive, false negative. We're hard at work. The numbers won't blow you away, but it's not about, I was a champion of doing observational studies, if you will, for all of these years. We're not lowering the evidentiary threshold. We're not lowering the bar. I don't care whether the number is 0, 100, or infinity, or anywhere in between. It is what it is. We want the data and the evidence to be good enough to protect the public health. All right, now again, I'm going to apologize too much or disclaim too much. I don't work in the AI/ML space, but here's a snapshot from our webpage. What role is AI/ML playing in drug development? This is very simple. It's throughout the drug development life cycle across a range of therapeutic areas, and the submissions have been increasing. So what I have, just to sort of, I guess the word, well, actually, no, this slide is courtesy of my colleague Talifa Khoury, and from her slide set, and nothing shocking here, nothing new, but we just have to keep track as an agency of where we are on this high-level overview landscape. And we have different parts of the FDA, as we talked about last hour, working in different spaces here. But what I was thinking of was a few of these selected notes, I'm calling them, just to give some flavor of what's happening. We had 1 AI/ML application in 2016, and as of 2022, it was 175. The numbers for 2023 are being tabulated. I'm not putting stock in the exact number, but basically, surprise, surprise, it's increasing. And a recent example, AI was used to help develop a scoring rule for identifying patients included in the emergency use authorization for anakinra to treat COVID-19. That was just sort of caught our attention because we had emergency use authorization is a different approach in public health emergencies. And we had a very robust discussion at a medical policy council about what to do with the AI. I think it's representative of what we're seeing. You're probably aware, we published a discussion paper on using AI and ML in the development of drugs and biologic products, pretty high level, but we had to start somewhere. And then I will say the president's executive order has several deliverables for the FDA, including a guidance, which we were going to write anyway. So that's where I think you all are in a position again to comment. All right, so in the remaining time, where are we now? A couple of years ago, Jacqueline Corrigan-Caray, who was the office director at the time, and I published an article that tried to give a high-level overview, addressing two common misconceptions, providing conceptual overview of study design, describing demonstration projects and guidance, which I've done, and regulatory approvals, et cetera. I think I've already covered these, but just to reemphasize the point, real-world data and real-world evidence are not new concepts. Sources of data and types of study designs evolve, but they haven't fundamentally changed. We're still talking about observational cohorts or case controls or randomized trials. It's the access to more detailed clinical data that's evolving, and by becoming more relevant, reliable, we can do more. That's important to appreciate. And also a simple dichotomy of RCTs versus observational studies is just plain wrong. In reality, trials are defined, by the assignment of treatment according to a protocol. And here, this is underappreciated. Single-arm trial doesn't have a comparison group, right? So whether you use a benchmark or you use a real-world data comparator arm that makes it an externally controlled trial, you start getting into propensity scores. It walks and quacks and waddles as if it's a duck, AKA an observational study. It's not, but we have to appreciate. So just because a clinical trial is being done, now if it's a tumor that doesn't shrink, as some of my colleagues like to say, or Banting and Best and that Beagle in 19 whatever, you didn't need a comparison group. Or if I'm unfortunate enough to have a traumatic injury, I don't need a randomized trial of microsurgery to reattach my finger. If they do it and it works, we're good, right? So this is determinism versus probabilistic reasoning or stochastics at the other end of the spectrum. And here's where I'm not saying this should replace the pyramid or the triangle of hierarchy of research design, but we intentionally made this a horizontal, AKA flat rubric, where you have randomized interventional studies, non-randomized but still interventional studies, or non-randomized and non-interventional. Sorry for rushing through this, but you all know this. This is too jargony. We don't, but this is conceptually accurate. We usually talk about traditional RCTs, trials in practice settings, externally controlled trials, or observational studies. The main point of this slide is for FDA purposes, the generation of real-world evidence only starts when you have meaningful real-world data in a trial, like a point-of-care trial. We don't say that real-world evidence is generated because you use real-world data to assess enrollment criteria. Kudos. You have to do that, but that's not real-world evidence. That's just routine work. Likewise, to support selection of trial sites. So this seems painfully simple, but it was, I think it honestly, why would the New England Journal bother with an essay like this? It was a perspective piece, but the increasing reliance on real-world data, which it's a case-by-case basis, but just conceptually, let's keep just like as an internist, I would never want to confuse acidosis and acidemia. But in a rough parallel, it's the same idea here. Let's keep our terminology straight. Okay, so this is also very high level, invoking my clinical training. This is a review of systems, if you will. We take it down to the level of criteria, but are the real world data fit for use? Relevance and reliability? Can the study design generate adequate scientific evidence, adequate defined by, again, our regulations? And does study conduct meet regulatory requirements, including inspection purposes and the like? So I want to give one example, and this, I guess, not only shows that we can do a 21st Century Cures Act, but I'll give, Congress has what, single-digit approval rating. I'll give them a nod that, you know, there was some wisdom in the 21st Century Cures Act. Crograf, tacrolimus had been approved for prophylaxis of organ rejection for liver, later kidney and heart, based on traditional randomized controlled trial evidence. It was used widely off-label for lung transplant for various reasons. I think because heart-lung transplants were often done together. Clinicians are smart. If the drug works, use it. And we don't need FDA approval, but for insurance purposes, sometimes FDA approval is needed. So there was a lot of concern about the lack of FDA approval. Not only had RCTs not been done, or at least not submitted, but they weren't going to be done. It would be horribly unethical to randomize patients to Prograf or placebo. And because what we had were historical controls with a 1-year graft rejection or fatality rate approached 100%. I mean, that was in the 1970s. It was pioneering to attempt a lung transplant. So long story short, a supplemental NDA was submitted with a non-interventional quote unquote RWE study. The data and design were evaluated according to FDA standards. And we approved the drug in 2021. To get a little bit under the hood, the data were reliable and relevant. They were from the US Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients. Talk about generalizability. This is better than a clinical trial. I don't mean to say that other than it's a fact. All patients in the US. Now, that doesn't mean it's valid, but it sure as heck is generalizable. And in terms of the validity of the data, it was just as rigorous, to the credit of the registry, as a clinical trial would have done. They had now that doesn't happen all the time. This is about as good as it gets. But we compared that non-interventional, the treatment was given by clinical care, by clinical decisions, to historical controls, and the analysis plan and the patient level data regarding study conduct were submitted to FDA. We reviewed the non-interventional study and found it to be adequate and well controlled. Now, I will say, this seems too good to be true. It's not, it is true. But it also helped that the outcomes of organ rejection and death are virtually certain to occur without therapy, and the dramatic effects help to preclude bias. So what we're getting at here, it's a little bit hard to wrap our heads around, but the idea is like the expected effect size. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from common knowledge, which could be flawed. But if you're talking about a literature where there's a hazard ratio of like 1.2 or 0.8 for benefit, and you have an awful lot of bias, we're not going to have as much confidence in that the residual confounding, for example, or even that the confounding in the first place, the known confounders have been addressed. This is what we're dealing with at the FDA, and it's a brand new world, because for years and years and decades, it's been all clinical trials where, again, clinical trials don't always get it right. They could be small, they could be underpowered, there could be problems with the conduct, but it has that prospective infrastructure to have randomization. I'm not knocking it. Okay. And here's where I cannot talk about individual studies that failed or submissions that failed, but I can put together this slide, which is a collated list of what went wrong. It's the same 3 categories of problems with data, problems with study design, or problems with conduct. Certainly, reliability and clinical relevance leads the pack. Need for linkage to other data sources. Just because one has a certain data source doesn't mean that it's going to get the job done. But what we mean by missing data should be self-evident, although there are different types of missingness, as we know. But missed time data, we don't fault clinicians for not getting assessments at Q3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, like a trial would do. So how permissive do you want to be? And then suitable capture of endpoints is often overlooked. The idea that not all endpoints, I mentioned earlier, MI, stroke, and death, hard. How am I feeling today? Soft. I'm exaggerating to make the point. For the study design, of course, confounding, but I also want to invoke immortal time and immortal time bias. Underappreciated, we see problems with it all the time, has to be addressed, and the roadmap, TL roadmap and others approaches are helpful in that regard, or the use of an inappropriate comparator. And then insufficient confirmation of pre-specified protocol, I alluded to that earlier. You can't just collect the data and then decide on an analysis that suits the bill. And then the inspection is actually a challenge for us, because our regs are set up for inspecting clinical trial data, and we want to honor the regs, but we also don't, sometimes it's almost impossible to inspect the data. All right, so I think I'm leaving time for questions. I'm wrapping up here. I had a slide earlier that said what we had to do. I think the record does show that we did establish our program, we did issue our framework, we did issue guidance, and we met our commitments. And to the best of my knowledge, I know to the best of our ability, we are maintaining our evidentiary standard. And to the best of my knowledge, we haven't messed up yet, and we hope not to. But we do make, actually, it reminds me of, Ida, you and I were at a different conference. The drug approval for Alzheimer's with the drug aducanumab was very controversial. I'm not here to talk about that, but that was based on trial evidence. So trials aren't a cakewalk, and we shouldn't expect observational studies or externally controlled trials to be a quote unquote cakewalk either. So I think it's actually reassuring if we're struggling and we make point in time decisions based on, a lot of the decisions are clear enough that the drug is either approved or it's not approved, and there's no fuss. It's that 2.5% that Steve Goodman identified in one of his articles from the Annals of Internal Medicine a few years ago that caused a lot of press and fuss in the press, a lot of press coverage. But I think the test of time will determine whether or not a drug works, and there are mechanisms to have such drugs removed if they don't. So I will paraphrase this closing paragraph from that same article. Hopefully, my talk today has been conveying the message that we remain committed to robust policy development aligned with the 21st Century Cures Act, but while maintaining evidentiary standards and honoring our obligation to protect and promote the public health. But more for sponsors than for you all, but focusing on the distinction between interventional and non-interventional studies can help everyone describe relevant methodologic issues, and gaining more experience, including the conduct of rigorous non-interventional studies with or without AI, ML, et cetera, genomics, will help to advance drug development. I don't think we mentioned AI or ML, we may have. So in sum, back to my objectives, hopefully I've been clear that big data has contributed to changes in how evidence generation is approached and described, and research methods are evolving, including by you all. Bring it on. We'd love to have more methods and see sponsors try them. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but they're always informative. Our guidance and related efforts, along with other efforts by stakeholders, are addressing current challenges. And again, if I'm saying it ad infinitum, that's intentional. We will seek to maintain our evidentiary standards, even when we're considering real-world data, one standard, not a different standard. And sometimes we see that in sponsors, oh, this is an RWE study, therefore, isn't it good enough? I don't hold it against them, but that's a bad sign, a red flag almost in terms of their application. I'm at the end here. I have too many people to thank, so I'll just leave it on this slide. And I'll say if there are any questions, I'll take them now. Or if there are any questions we don't get to or you think of them later, please use this email address and I will get to it with my colleagues as soon as I can. Thank you very much for your attention.
They want to stop sharing.
Thanks.
Happy to take questions. We'll start with people in the room and also those who are on the Zoom. If you have questions, you can either put them in the chat or we'll have to.
And Daniel, can I ask you to help check the chat?
Brianna is also our colleague.
Okay, we have one in the room, at least.
Thanks. Wonderful. So we've been following question. One of the issues that we see is about what the standards HR is a very important. When we would conduct a study, we would ideally follow it or maybe transform it to something, a data structure, let's say, when we transform the data from the raw to we intend to use a lot of information. And that information then becomes perspective becomes unobserved information. So are there any guidance in the process that what kind of exact standards that one should follow to have then follow the pipeline of the carbon trend?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
John, the question is not audible to people.
Oh, okay. Thank you. The question was largely about data standards and say whether it's common data models, whether it's OMOP or anything else, information is lost. So what is FDA doing about it? And, sorry, you were much more articulate than I just recapitulated for those on Zoom. But I would say I'm going to give credit to my colleagues in the Office of Strategic Programs who the demonstration projects that I listed were in our own backyard of the Office of Medical Policy and were very general. But there are efforts underway that are very specifically focused on that, plus the recognition that we do need regulation changes, that is, down the road, which it takes a while to do that, to sort of accommodate. But we do want to, we're not just putting our head in the sand. We don't want to endorse one approach. Rather, I would say that show us the rigor of the approach you used, and that will actually be judged on its merits. And if it's successful, we don't talk about for commercial trade secret and company protection. We don't talk about applications that fail. But like with the Prograph, we published a review as soon as we possibly could so that everyone could look at it, not to copy paste it, but to learn from what was done and almost get a window into our thinking. So I would say it's probably a case by case basis, but reach out in general. You're not a sponsor, but we tell sponsors all the time, reach out to the FDA early on. And actually what I skipped over, the Advancing Real World Evidence Program as part of PDUFA 7 is intentionally designed for that reason, that we saw a lot of submissions that were hundreds, if not 1,000+ pages, countless person hours. And we looked and we said, did they really think that that would work? Now, maybe they're right and we're wrong, but we're the FDA. So we were basically saying that you guys and girls wasted your time or didn't use your time efficiently. So the whole idea is to come early, not for a theoretical question, but for an actual submission and engage with us so we can give feedback. We're actually in the middle of a cycle now. We haven't published on that because we want enough of a denominator to provide some anonymity. Does that begin to address your question?
We implemented some of the cross usage, like standardized data, performance of fitness and some kind of compliance and things like that. But there weren't many.
True. There isn't as much guidance as would be optimal, but we're trying to move the field forward in incremental fashion with one step at a time. So thank you for that feedback. Other questions? Yes. Dan.
Thanks. I'm curious about post-marketing. I mean, a lot of the attention was sort of approval and pre, and I'm curious about post-marketing questions, both when to stop, changing treatments, comparative effectiveness, and other things. And how will that, how do you think that will play out for you guys?
Yeah, in a way, because as we discussed, before this session, what we now call real world data, real world evidence has always, has been done for decades in the safety space. I'm not saying nothing is changing, but in part, it's a matter of just keeping track. Like our report in June, we'll talk about PMRs and PMCs, post-marketing requirements and commitments. I think it's been a healthy, cross-fertilization might not be the best term, but I don't know that anything is fundamentally different as much as now we're just different teams are working together and we're calling it real world evidence. But I know the ICH efforts for international convergence and harmonization, M14 is on pharmacovigilance. That's basically the safety end of the spectrum. So we're working with, there's an ICH reflection paper, and we're having not a terribly tough time, but it's sort of interesting and almost awkward to say, well, are we just doing effectiveness or are we doing effectiveness and safety? So do you have a specific concern, or is it more of a general question of how is this playing out almost sociologically? Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating phenomenon. And actually, I think what's also interesting is OSE, the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology in the FDA. It's not that it was off in a corner for safety, but they're probably happy about the real world evidence era because now their skill set, and it's true for all of us, right? I mean, I remember when I was doing observational studies, some of the tenured faculty, when I was an assistant professor, was like, oh, isn't that something you do if you fail at the bench? This is actually not about trials versus observational studies. This is about wet bench laboratory science versus patient-oriented research. If you fail at the bench, you can wake up the next day and go to the bedside and become a patient-oriented researcher or a health services researcher. Sorry, I'm being informal here, but I know I'm being recorded. It's what I experienced, and I'm sharing my perspective on it. But thank you, Dan. Other questions? I'll let someone else check the chat. I do think the numbers have ticked up. Was there a question? Oh.
So you mentioned examples that I think they're in the one is the emergency equipment for COVID.
Oh, the Anakira, yeah. Or Anakinra. Yes.
Even though it was a different indication for 20 years ago, like let's say.
Well, it didn't take 20 years. I think it took the data had been probably ample enough after, don't quote me here, a few years. It took sociologically, historically, it took the 21st Century Cures Act and the FDA Real World Evidence Program. I'm not being immodest here. I wasn't here in 2018, by the way. I wasn't at the FDA yet, so I don't take any credit for the framework. But it took that shift because otherwise, if the sponsor would have submitted the data, the FDA probably would have issued a complete response letter saying, where are your trials? Steve Goodman talked about it yesterday. We have a 2-trial rule, and it's not his rule, it was our rule, and it's in our guidance. But it's almost telling to say that if I had $1 for every time I've corrected my colleagues or mentioned to my colleagues that when you say trial in a particular context, you might mean study, because it's no longer true that it has to be a trial. it could be a study. That's, I think, the evolution of the field. So the data, in fact, there were, I think, upwards of 20,000 patients. The power was ridiculously ample. It was like 90% survival versus 95+% survival versus close to zero. So we didn't need all of those patients. It was more, and the anakinra that was specifically AI. It was actually a trial. So the AI use was in a traditional trial because emergency use authorization, the drug isn't out there yet. You're not going to have real world data. That's another interesting aspect of it. You need the drug to be approved for the real world data to be available.
There's one question in the chat from Seattle, Vermont.
Let me click on it if I could get it up here. A question, if there's time, do you have thoughts on natural experiments as a way to get RCT? Well, can you say more? Like, what do you mean by natural experiment? Is that a descriptive observational study? Is it?
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, but please speak loud.
Great. I will use my big boy voice. One of the things that, economists and other social scientists do a lot is try to find random or quasi-random ways that drugs are sometimes given to patients. So you go to a primary care doctor, and the primary care doctor you get is basically random because it's whoever's available when you show up. And one primary care doctor likes hydrochlorothiazide, and another likes another hypertensive. So you could imagine doing the VA-like study you cited without explicit randomization, but taking advantage of this implicit randomization that happens a lot in our healthcare system.
Thank you. Well, so let me say this. We're agnostic to study design. So I'm not sure if you're talking about instrumental variables or difference approaches or others, but I'm bringing those up just to say that we'll consider anything and everything. But having said that, some hills are harder to climb than others. It's not that we have a bias, so to speak, against the designs, but I think, again, it goes back to the data fit for use. Is the study design adequate? That's the key criterion. Is the study design adequate? So we would consider it, but I would say part of it is be careful if you're going in uncharted territory. It's not that we would treat you unfairly. I don't mean you personally treat the application unfairly. It's just that there's a lot of concerns that would have to be addressed. But yes, if the question literally is, do we have thoughts? My thoughts would be that, again, we're agnostic to study design, but not all study designs have it as an easy a time as others. Thank you. Okay, we're a little bit past time. Or is this a good time to wrap?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, wonderful. And thanks to those who attended on Zoom. Thank you. Great.
Okay.
Great. Let's stop that.